The wind rolled low across the plains that night, carrying with it the smell of dust, wood smoke, and something heavier blood waiting to be spilled. Malachi Brooks sat on the porch of his ranch house, hat pulled low, listening to the uneasy quiet that had fallen over his land. The cattle had gone still in their pens, their lowing cut short as if they, too, sensed what was coming. His hand rested close to the worn handle of his revolver, not from fear, but from instinct. A man who lived this far from town couldn't afford the luxury of doubt. It began with the sound of a single rider cutting through the silence. Hooves striking the hard-packed earth, slow and deliberate, like a drumbeat before execution. Malachi rose to his feet, every line of his body taut, and stepped into the yard. The moonlight broke enough to reveal the figure, tall, lean, a man who wore his violence openly. A rifle rested across his saddle, but it was the gleam of the long knife at his hip that drew Malachi's eye. Some men carried weapons for protection. This one carried them for pleasure. "Evening, rancher?" the stranger called, voice as rough as gravel dragged across steel. "Heard tell you been feeding mouths that ain't yours to feed." Malachi said nothing at first. He studied the man, the horse, the shadowed eyes that hid more than they revealed. Words could be as dangerous as bullets out here, and he had learned long ago that silence often kept him alive. The stranger spat into the dirt and nudged his horse closer. "Ain't right, you taking in strays. You give shelter, food, maybe even hope. But hope breeds trouble, makes folks forget their place." Malachi's jaw tightened. He thought of the mother and her child he had given bread to just 2 nights ago, ragged and starving, desperate enough to knock on a stranger's door. He had seen the hollow cheeks of the woman, the sunken eyes of her boy, and he would not turn them away. The memory of their gratitude still lingered, softening the hard edges of his solitude. But the man before him had no softness. His eyes were the eyes of a scavenger circling death. "This is my land," Malachi said at last, his voice steady. "I'll decide who eats at my table." The stranger's grin was slow, thin, and dangerous. "Then maybe it's time someone decided for you." In one fluid motion, the man swung down from his horse, boots hitting the ground with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. His hand hovered near the knife, and the air between them grew sharp, stretched to breaking. Malachi's fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, but he did not draw. Not yet. A gun was a final word, and he wanted the man to speak his intentions clear. "You drive folks away, rancher," the stranger said, pacing in a slow circle. "Or I drive you into the ground. Simple choice." The words were meant to intimidate, but what struck Malachi more was the emptiness behind them. This wasn't just a hired hand trying to scare him. This was a man who had come with purpose, someone sent or driven by those who believed kindness was weakness. Malachi squared his shoulders. "I've buried men for less." The silence that followed was broken only by the restless shifting of the horse. Then, in a blur of motion, the attacker lunged, knife flashing silver in the moonlight. Malachi drew. The revolver cracked once, the sound rolling across the valley like thunder. The knife never reached him. The stranger staggered back, hand pressed to his side, shock written across his face as though he had never considered he could bleed. He stumbled, cursed, and collapsed into the dust. The horse snorted and reared, before bolting into the darkness without its rider. For a moment, the world held still. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Malachi lowered his revolver, his breathing steady but his mind already racing. A lone attacker, bold enough to confront him on his own land, this was no accident. Someone had wanted a message delivered. Behind him, the front door creaked open. Mrs. Crane, weathered by age but still sharp as barbed wire, stepped into the night with her shotgun at the ready. Her gray eyes swept over the fallen body, then to Malachi. "Trouble came knocking sooner than I figured," she said flatly. Malachi nodded. "And it won't end with him." They buried the man at the edge of the property. No prayer said, no marker left. Coyotes would likely dig him up before long, but Malachi didn't care. His concern was not for the dead, but for the living who had sent him. Hours passed. Malachi sat on the porch again, watching the horizon. The ranch was silent. but it was a silence that carried weight, like the pause before a storm breaks. He thought of the tribes whose hunting grounds stretched beyond his fences, the ones who watched him with wary eyes whenever he rode too far from town. He had traded with some, clashed with others. They respected strength but despised cruelty, and though he had never sought to draw their attention, he had the unsettling feeling that tonight's violence had been witnessed by more eyes than his own. Near midnight, the sound began, distant at first, carried on the wind drums, faint and steady. Then voices, layered in low chants that rose and fell like the breathing of the earth itself. Malachi stood, scanning the darkness, and saw shadows moving on the ridge. Dozens of them. Riders cloaked in night, their silhouettes lit by the flickering glow of torches. Mrs. Crane stepped out again, shotgun in hand. "You expecting company?" "No," Malachi said quietly. "But they've come all the same." The riders descended slowly, not with the chaos of raiders, but with the solemn order of men bound by tradition. As they drew near, Malachi recognized the markings painted across their horses, the feathers woven into their hair. Different tribes, each with their own colors, their own histories, yet riding together. It was a sight he had never seen in all his years on the frontier. They came to a halt just beyond the gate. The leader, an older warrior with scars across his face, dismounted and stepped forward. His eyes, dark and sharp, studied Malachi with an intensity that made words unnecessary. Still, he spoke, his voice carrying in the still night. "We saw what happened here," he said. "We saw you stand against one who carries death like a banner. You defended your land, and more than that, you defended life when others would have let it wither." Malachi remained silent, unsure what answer would satisfy men who owed him nothing. But the warrior continued, "By sunrise, you will not stand alone. 12 tribes will honor this gate, not because we owe you, but because respect is given where it is earned. And tonight, rancher, you earned it." The words struck Malachi deeper than any bullet could. These were men who had watched him from afar, men who weighed every action as if it were a test of character, and somehow, without seeking it, he had passed. The warrior turned back to his people. The chants rose again, louder this time, filling the valley with a haunting promise. Malachi stood unmoving, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his fight had only just begun, but that when dawn came, he would not be fighting alone. The night deepened, and the chants of the tribes faded into the hills like smoke dissolving into air. By the time silence settled again, Malachi found himself standing alone at the gate, the echo of their promise still ringing in his ears. He could not shake the weight of those words. By sunrise, you will not stand alone. Mrs. Crane, ever practical, set the shotgun against the porch railing and folded her arms. "You just made yourself a figure in somebody else's story," she said. "Those tribes don't ride together for sport. Whatever they saw in you tonight, it tied you to them now. And when men get tied to tribes, it means either protection or bloodshed." Malachi rubbed a hand over his face, fatigue seeping into his bones. "It was one man," he said quietly. "One attacker, nothing more." Mrs. Crane's laugh was dry as sandpaper. "One attacker don't ride this far alone. Someone sent him. Someone with coin enough and hate enough to want you dead. You think the tribes don't know that? They know, Malachi. Better than you or me. They've been watching this land long before you drove your first post in the dirt." Her words left a hollow space in his chest. He looked out across the dark fields, where the cattle shifted nervously in their pens. The ranch had always been his refuge, a place where he could work with his hands and let the world's madness pass him by. But now the world had found him again, dragged to his doorstep by a dying man's knife and a promise from 12 tribes. Sleep never came easy that night. He drifted between restless dozing and sharp wakefulness, each creak of the house or distant howl of a coyote pulling him upright. By the time the eastern horizon began to pale, Malachi was already outside, coffee cup in hand, watching for signs of what dawn might bring. The first riders appeared with the sunrise. They came in silence, moving like shadows against the reddening sky. One by one, They gathered near the gate, first a handful, then dozens, until the yard was filled with the colors of 12 different tribes. Painted shields, feathered lances, and the glint of steel weapons caught the light of morning. Yet there was no hostility in their formation, only solemnity. The scarred warrior from the night before stepped forward again. Malachi recognized the authority in his bearing, the way others deferred to him without words. He raised a hand in greeting, palm outward. "We honor what we witnessed," he said. "Last night you stood. Today we stand with you. These tribes have not shared ground in many seasons, but here, at your gate, we do. Not for war, not for conquest, but for respect." Malachi inclined his head. "I didn't ask for this," he admitted. The warrior's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet understanding. Respect cannot be asked for. It is given or it is withheld. And when it is given, it binds. Malachi felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, the air charged with expectation. He was a rancher, not a leader of men, yet somehow the blood he had spilled had pulled him into their circle. His choices from this moment would ripple further than he could measure. Behind him, Mrs. Crane emerged from the house, her apron still dusted with flour from morning bread. She studied the scene with wary eyes, but said nothing. The tribes were not hers to question. Then, from the far ridge, dust rose. Another group of riders this time, not solemn tribesmen, but hard-eyed gunmen in worn hats and long coats. Malachi felt his stomach tighten. The tribes shifted, murmurs rippling through their ranks. The scarred warrior gave a sharp command, and men moved into formation, a wall of bodies and horses between the ranch and the oncoming threat. Malachi's hand went instinctively to his revolver. The lead gunman raised a hand in mock greeting as he rode forward. His voice carried across the field, smooth and cruel. "Fine morning for a funeral, rancher. Shame you wasted your bullet last night. Won't be enough this time." Malachi stepped to the gate, his stance unflinching though his heart thundered. "This is my land. You've got no claim here." The gunman's grin widened. "Your land? Everything out here belongs to the man with the will to take it. You think a few painted savages at your gate'll scare me off? Think again. We've burned villages bigger than this ranch." The tribes bristled, weapons lifting slightly, but the scarred warrior held them back with a single raised hand. His eyes burned as he stared at the intruders. "You come with threats," he said in a low, steady voice. "We come with memory. This land remembers the blood of our fathers, our sons. It will remember yours too if you force it." The tension knotted tighter than a noose. Malachi stood in the space between two worlds, one built on the fragile fence lines of settlers, the other rooted in generations of unbroken earth. And for a fleeting moment, he wondered if his shot last night had not simply killed one man, but opened a wound that would bleed until the whole valley drowned in it. The gunman spat into the dirt, the same gesture the attacker had made the night before. "You're making a mistake, rancher. These people ain't your friends. When it suits them, they'll leave you to hang. Mark my words." Malachi's reply came without thought, his voice low but edged with iron. "Then let it be my mistake. But I'll not bow to men who come riding with knives for the hungry." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the gunman sneered and pulled at his reins. "We'll be back, and when we come, neither your gun nor their chance will save you." The riders wheeled their horses and thundered off, dust swallowing their retreat. The tribes did not move until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did the scarred warrior turn back to Malachi. "You have enemies with deep pockets," he said, "men who see mercy as weakness. But last night, you showed strength of another kind, and that kind of strength has power." Malachi exhaled slowly. "Power don't interest me. All I want is peace on this land." The warrior's gaze softened, though it did not lose its intensity. Peace is not given. It is built, sometimes with stone, sometimes with blood. You must decide which you are willing to lay down. The words struck Malachi like a brand pressed to flesh. He had chosen kindness, and it had brought him violence. He had defended his land, and it had brought him tribes. Now the weight of both pressed heavy on his shoulders. As the morning wore on, the tribes did not disperse. Fires were lit, meals shared, watchmen posted along the ridges. It became clear to Malachi that this was no passing gesture. The promise made in the night was being carved into the day itself. The tribes had bound themselves to his gate, and in doing so, bound him to them. Mrs. Crane approached quietly, her voice low so only he could hear. You saved one woman and her boy with a loaf of bread. Now you got a valley full of tribes watching your back. Don't think for a second this ends with gratitude. Gratitude's a leash, Malachi, and you just put it round your own neck. Malachi said nothing. He watched the smoke from the tribal fires curl into the brightening sky and wondered if sunrise had brought him protection or a war that had only just begun. The sun had climbed higher by the time Malachi felt the first tremor in the earth. It wasn't the tremor of cattle shifting restlessly or a single rider approaching. This was heavier dozens of hooves pounding the hardpan in unison. The sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder, and every head among the tribes lifted. The scarred warrior barked a command in his tongue, and the camps shifted instantly into order. Fires doused, spears lifted, riders mounting with the precision of men born for battle. The air grew taut with anticipation, as though the land itself braced for blood. Malachi stepped to the gate, revolver at his hip, and felt the sweat trickle down the back of his neck. He had always thought himself a solitary man, a survivor on the edge of the world. But now, with 12 tribes gathered at his side, he realized solitude was a luxury he could no longer claim. The riders came into view over the ridge, 40, maybe 50 men, hard-faced and armed to the teeth. The lead gunman, the one who had threatened him at sunrise, rode at the front. His voice cut through the still morning. You had your warning, rancher. Now you'll pay for defying men who hold this land in their grip. Step aside and maybe we leave enough of your bones to bury. The tribes answered, not with words, but with the thundering beat of drums. Horses reared, painted shields raised, chants erupting in a wall of sound that shook the dust from the very fence posts. The gunmen hesitated, their bravado flickering at the sight of unity they had not expected. The scarred warrior rode forward, his spear gleaming in the Sunday, his voice rang with the weight of generations. You come here to spill blood for greed. We come to spill blood for memory. You see one rancher. We see a man who fed the hungry when the rich would let them starve. We stand here not for him alone, but for what it means to stand at all. Leave now, or the earth will drink your blood. The lead gunman laughed, though it wavered at the edges. You think I'm scared of chance and feathers? We got bullets, enough to tear through every one of you. Malachi's voice cut across both sides, calm but edged with steel. Bullets or not, you ride into this yard, you'll ride into the jaws of 12 tribes who ain't forgotten what was taken from them. I don't reckon you'll live to count the cost. For a heartbeat, the standoff held. Dust swirled, horses shifted, fingers twitched near triggers. Then the lead gunman gave the order. Burn it down. Chaos exploded. Gunfire cracked like lightning. Arrows hissed through the air, and the valley erupted into war. Malachi drew his revolver and fired. Each shot measured, deliberate. He saw a rider fall, another wheel his horse away screaming, blood painting the dust. Around him, the tribes moved with a fury he had never witnessed. Silent discipline turned to roaring vengeance. Spears struck true, tomahawks flashed, and war cries split the sky. The attackers had come expecting an easy slaughter, but instead, they met the weight of history, 12 tribes fighting as one. The clash was brutal, primal, dust and blood mingling until the earth itself seemed to groan beneath the carnage. Malachi fought alongside them, each bullet an act of defiance, each breath a vow that this land would not be taken. He saw the scarred warrior drive his spear through the chest of a rider, saw Mrs. Crane fire both barrels of her shotgun from the porch, her eyes cold and steady as stone. But the lead gunman pressed forward, his hatred fixed on Malachi. He rode hard through the melee, pistol blazing, cutting down anyone in his path. Malachi turned just in time to meet him, revolver raised. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that single exchange, the weight of defiance against the greed of power. They fired at the same time. The gunman's bullet grazed Malachi's shoulder, searing pain tearing through him. Malachi's shot struck true, slamming into the man's chest. He reeled in the saddle, shock etched across his face before tumbling lifeless into the dust. The cry went up among the tribes, loud and fierce. With their leader dead, the remaining gunmen faltered. Some tried to rally, others turned to flee. But the tribes pressed forward like a storm, breaking them, scattering them to the winds. Within minutes, the field was cleared. The survivors rode hard for the horizon, leaving behind their dead. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant call of carrion birds already circling. Malachi stood at the gate, blood soaking his shirt, his revolver heavy in his hand. Around him, the tribes began to gather, their chants rising not in rage but in solemnity. The scarred warrior approached, his spear still stained with blood. He dismounted and placed a hand on Malachi's shoulder. "You stood," he said simply. "When greed came with fire, you did not bow. Now, the land remembers your name. By sunrise, you are not alone. You will never be alone again." Malachi looked out over the valley, the broken bodies, the smoke rising from spent gunpowder, the tribes standing in unity. He felt the weight of what had been won and the cost it carried. He had not sought their respect, nor their allegiance, but by one act of defiance, by feeding the hungry, by standing when others would have knelt, he had become bound to something greater than himself. The chants rose higher, echoing against the ridges, a promise carried on the wind. And as the sun climbed fully into the sky, Malachi knew that the fight for his land, his life, and the lives of those who sought shelter here was far from over. But he also knew this: when the next storm came, 12 tribes would stand at his gate. And that was a power no bullet could erase. Stories like these remind us that a single act of courage, choosing kindness when it is easier to turn away, can ripple outward until it changes everything. Malachi fed the hungry and stood his ground, and by sunrise, he earned the respect of 12 tribes who vowed to stand with him. In our own lives, we may never face riders at the gate or bullets in the dust, but we do face choices whether to act with compassion, to stand firm in the face of injustice, or to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And sometimes, those choices define us more than we realize. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, don't let it end here. Share it. Let it live beyond this moment. Subscribe for more stories that shine a light on courage, sacrifice, and the power of doing what is right even when the cost is high. Because sometimes, one act of kindness can change not just a life, but the course of history.